terrorists. If we're going to address the challenge of their efforts to recruit,
it is vital that we win the propaganda war.
Make no mistake, this was a terrorist attack.
Welcome to Extreme Calls, the podcast where you learn about extremist communications and propaganda. My name is Stefan Bale from the University of Exeter, and today we look at the so-called Manosphere. Over the years, a vast constellation of misogynistic websites, forums, blogs, static sites, and more has grown. Some of them so extreme that they are linked to real-world acts of violence, such as Alec Minashan's van rampage in Toronto in April 2018, when 10 people died and 16 others were injured. Cases like these seem to be multiplying, leading authorities to take the Manosphere seriously, and this is why we dedicate this extreme call to it.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language and cite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet.
To ensure that such events never occur again. Preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility.
And to do so, it is my great pleasure to have with me Debbie Ging, who has from early on dedicated her career to this underworld. Debbie, welcome and thanks to take part in Extreme Calls.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for having me participate.
So you are an associate professor in the School of Communications at Dublin City University, where you teach and research on gender, sexuality, and digital media with a focus on digital hate, online anti-feminist, men's rights politics, and the incel phenomenon. All these words, I guess we're going to explain them in a minute, but let me also add that you have published, of course, widely on these issues with papers like Alphas, Betas, and Incels theorizing the masculinities of the Manosphere in 2017, and then also one that I would like to highlight, Dataset for Automatic Detection of Online Misogynistic Speech, 2019, and recently a volume edited with a colleague of yours called Eugenia Ciapera. Sorry if I don't tell the name correctly. Gender Hate Online, Understanding the New Anti-Feminism. And you are also in the editorial board of the journal New Media and Society. So I would like to start this call with a very general question. To set the context and to clarify the basic tenets of the discussion. What exactly is this Manosphere that you're studying? Why is it important, and what are the main characteristics of this Manosphere? Is that some kind of misogynistic online ecosystem?
Yeah, effectively, that's what it is. And I think an ecosystem is a good way to describe it because it's kind of ever changing and ever evolving. So, you know, it's a very loose network of different assemblages, different online assemblages where anti-feminist men communicate with one another, but also kind of communicate with the wider world. And it's, you know, it's not static. And although it has kind of central hubs, it moves around. It's a bit like a swarm of bees, or lots and lots of different swarms of bees to kind of wherever the next flashpoint is. So it's difficult to kind of pinpoint in a kind of concrete way, and that's why I think the kind of idea of overlapping and interacting assemblages is probably the best way to imagine it. It's also very difficult to quantify. And I think we have to get away, very often people ask me, well, how many incels are there, for example, or how many MRAs are there? I mean, what size is this community? And that's a really important question, because we probably need to get away from the idea of counting members of the community and look instead at trying to maybe quantify impact, because obviously a lot of these voices and these ideas are amplified by the technological affordances of social media. So it's less really to do with how many individual members of the community exist, but rather with the kind of impact they have, you know, in many different ways, even in terms of kind of silencing or self-censoring women to contribute in particular forums, etc. So that impact, though, of course, is very difficult to quantify. In terms of, you know, the different kind of groups that make up the manosphere, you have broad kind of subsets, if you like. So incels would be one of them. And there's, you know, a lot of them kind of overlap with one another. So, you know, a lot of the incel community would overlap quite a bit with the kind of geek and gamer factions of the manosphere, the kind of techno-libertarian end of the spectrum. But you also have at the other end tradcons, traditional conservatives, who'd be, you know, more in line with the kind of Trump supporters, if you like, and kind of Christian conservative perspectives. You have pickup artists, which are another subgrouping, you know, who are heavily invested in men's sexual success with women and seduction techniques. That's also a highly kind of commodified end of the manosphere. Rachel O'Neill has done some really brilliant work on the seduction industry in a kind of economic analytical context. And then you have MGTOWs, which are men going their own way who've decided to have nothing to do with women. And so those would be broadly the different categories that make up the manosphere. But you have a lot of other interest groups which kind of circle around the periphery. You know, there's obviously hardcore pornography, firearms, mail order brides. There's all kinds of other kind of sub groups or interests that tend to kind of circulate in that space as well.
Okay, so basically, it's really if I understand you correctly, it's really it seems to be a very broad ecosystem with a series of communities that somehow overlap but are not completely the same, and each has its own kind of specificity. But they all share what extreme misogynistic views or some sort of misogyny, or is that a common thread, or do you have some kind of degree in the intensity of hatred towards women?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are somewhat more politicized than others. You know, like the more kind of mainstream MRA groups, like A Voice for Men, for example, in the States, would have maybe a more overtly political agenda in terms of divorce legislation, custody. You know, they're kind of heavily preoccupied with the idea of false rape claims. So they do try to mobilize around kind of legal issues to some extent, whereas the vast majority of anti-feminist men's rights politics online is very personalized. And this is a key kind of shift that I noticed in terms of studying, you know, men's rights politics, is that the shift from kind of pre-internet to Web 2.0 has entailed a kind of an interesting trajectory from the political and the collective to the individual and the personal. And so a lot of the misogyny seems to be a kind of venting of frustration and hatred towards women around sex and around men's inability to have the sex with women to which they believe they're entitled. And that would be at the kind of, you know, very much the incel and pickup artist end of it. So some, for example, Sarah Bannett-Weiser argues that the incel phenomenon, emerges directly from the failure of the whole kind of pickup artist scam, which promised men successful seduction techniques with women, but ultimately these failed, and therefore gave rise to this very angry cohort of men who felt kind of hard done by and cheated. So there's a lot of animosity among certain incel communities towards pickup artists. There's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of contradictions, but they are loosely pulled together by their dislike of feminism, first and foremost, but also very often of women more generally. Although there are varying gradations of that misogyny. So some would claim simply to be anti-feminism, but not misogynistic. They say they have nothing against women. Whereas if you go on a lot of incel forums, you will see a lot of really deeply misogynistic content. And even in their claims, a lot of the claims that the anti-feminism is a political manifestation. In fact, the way in which that anti-feminism manifests itself is usually deeply misogynistic.
Right. And so we were talking, one last question to really clarify what we're talking about here. We're talking about what? Blogs, forums, websites, YouTube channels, a little bit of everything?
Yeah, absolutely. Across the board in terms of different types of platforms, websites, blogs, etc. So you would have hubs, particularly for, say, the incel community and the more extreme kind of techno-libertarian end of the manosphere, the kind of geekier end. Traditionally, those hubs would be, say, 4chan, various channels on 4chan and various subreddits. And also then the incels .co forum as well. So there's different kind of areas where different groups will focus. You vote as well, but you also have quite a lot of this activity on YouTube. So there's a huge overlap as well between the manosphere and the alt-right.
Okay.
So those spaces where you see a lot of alt-right activity, there's usually quite a lot of manosphere activity as well. So yeah, it operates across a huge range of different formats and platforms and spaces.
Okay, can you briefly tell us, and after that, I think I would like to have maybe a bit more focus on the incel phenomenon, if that's right with you. But before that, just a quick question out of curiosity: what prompted you to study this online environment? Because what was your intellectual journey towards that made you investigate this kind of online underworld? Very
Interesting, I guess.
briefly.
Yeah, I in the early 1990s, I was looking mostly at the kind of backlash that we were seeing emerging in different forms of popular culture. So film, television, men's magazines, the kind of the emergence of all of those lad mags in the UK, and then the American versions of them as well. So I was interested in what was prompting this this lad culture, and then a kind of deeper misogyny that was going on behind it, because lad culture was supposed to be ironic and jokey and not terribly serious, but I could already see, I suppose, or feel a deeper misogynistic undercurrent there. And so we also started to see this emergence of the beleaguered white male, the idea of the white middle class male as victim emerging in a lot of films around the same time. What Fred File calls as well kind of male rampage films, where the white male seeks revenge or goes on some kind of a rampage. So I started researching the men's movement at the time as a way to try to understand, where this sentiment was coming from, was, what was going on at a kind of sociological level, where, you know, because this rhetoric, these sentiments weren't kind of coming from nowhere. And so I started looking at, you know, the different types of anti-feminist men's movements, and then some of those men's rights groups which weren't really overtly anti-feminist, like the male mytho-poetic movement in the United States in the early 90s. So Robert Bly's Iron John, which was published, I think, in 1992, made that whole movement quite popular. The idea of men trying to reclaim some kind of masculine essence and resist the civilizing influence of women. A lot of the kind of stuff that Jordan Peterson would talk about now, I guess, you know, had its origins back in what seemed like somewhat more innocuous groupings of men's rights. And then you had much more overtly anti-feminist men's rights groups emerging at the time, and a wider discourse in the mainstream media of, you know, are men obsolete, the end of men, all that kind of thing that was going on. So there was, you know, a sense of some kind of crisis in the patriarchy and in, I guess, acceptable modes of doing masculinity. And so then I became interested when these ideas and these political groupings moved onto the internet, moved particularly into social media spaces. There was a very kind of significant change, a very significant rhetorical, discursive change in terms of how they express their ideas. So the key one of these, as I say, is the change from the kind of collective, a kind of collective politics, a more traditional way of doing politics, like demonstrations, petitions, you know, fathers' rights, all that kind of stuff, to a highly personalized politics, a very affective, a very emotional kind of politics that seems very much more about the self, about victimhood, about pain, about suffering, about rejection, all expressed in a very kind of personal way, and all expressed towards women as well in a very kind of personalized way in the form of personal attacks, etc. So it was much more misogynistic, but much more individualistic as well. So I thought that those were really interesting rhetorical, you know, from kind of political communication perspective, even really significant changes in the you know, the way in which this movement or different movements were suddenly expressed. Not suddenly, I guess it happened over time, but expressing themselves.
Okay, and that leads us to the discussion on the so-called incel community, right? That community has been, I think, brought under the news spotlight with the attack that happened in Toronto in spring 2018 by Alec Menashen. And I would like to hear a little bit more about this specific, if you want, sub-community or community within the broader manosphere, this incel community. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of ideas this community, or what kind of ideology is characterizing this community? You know, what would be the thing that you would want the audience to know about this community? Because obviously here we have a clear link to violence, right? And I think it's not the only one. So there must be something very specific about this this online group.
Yeah, although again, I think there are very different types of adherence to incel groups within these spaces. I don't think they're all the same. And I think like they kind of operate a little bit like a cult. It's very much about, you know, boundary work. It's about creating kind of an in-group and an out-group. It's a kind of a quintessential echo chamber in that regard. It's not just that you know, you become kind of radicalized into this group because the same kind of information keeps coming your way. You kind of buy in to the philosophy completely from the get-go, and so nothing is really going to change your mind, because the outside world is, according to, you know, red pill philosophy, the outside world is deluded, it's blue pilled, and you're, you know, you've seen the light. So already there's this sense of us and them, which I think functions rather like a cult in many ways. Core to this, and core to all of the manosphere, is evolutionary psychology. So they've adopted this kind of pseudoscience of evolutionary psychology, lock, stock and barrel. And even though it's kind of riddled with contradictions, because on the one hand, it's feminism's fault, you know, that these men can't get the sex to which they feel entitled, because women are now sexually liberated and they can have sex with as many men as they want. You know, there's no onus on women to get married anymore. So, you know, the patriarchy has lost its grip on women. So on the one hand, you know, feminism is to blame, and yet then there are all these kind of half-baked ideas mobilized from evolutionary psychology, whereby it's, you know, argued that this is inherently part of women's nature to seek out alpha males. And the problem is that alpha males are in short supply.
So alpha males are what, the good-looking men, or?
Yeah, the good-looking men, the men who are physically, again, this comes down not so much to earning potential or those more traditional signifiers of masculinity. And that's unsurprising, given, you know, the kind of very unstable neoliberal capitalist economy in which we live. Those traditional signifiers of masculinity, like owning property or having a career for life, all of those things have kind of disappeared. So in many ways, there's a sense of double emasculation, because in the absence of economic status, I think this is probably where why men are turning to the body instead. And there's a lot of the incels are very preoccupied with the fact that their bodies don't live up to alpha standards in terms of, you know, they're very, very specific. It's to do with, you know, height, muscularity, muscular physique, broad shoulders, jaw lines. There's a, you know, real preoccupation with having a square jaw, etc. And because they don't live up to those standards of alpha masculinity, they feel almost kind of doomed to never find a sexual partner, because they will argue that women are hypergamous, that they're biologically hardwired to always marry up, to always seek out an alpha male. So these are evolutionary, kind of half-baked evolutionary theories about, you know, women's desire to reproduce with an alpha male, etc. So they feel kind of, it's very fatalistic, a lot of the discourse. They feel kind of doomed in a way. But, you know, have they been screwed over by nature? You know, by the kind of is this their biological destiny, or have they been screwed over by a socio-political movement like feminism? And so both of those ideas are constantly kind of thrown out at the same time, and there's no real kind of recognition to how contradictory those ideas are, I guess. Broadly, I suppose there's lots of different types of incels, and that includes not just white men. There's lots of different ethnicities as well. But broadly, I suppose you could say there's two main groups, in that you have the kind of red-pilled incels who still, I guess, feel that there's some point in trying to aspire to alpha masculinity, who'll engage in, you know, body improvement activities like going to the gym selling, taking steroids, steroid maxing, they call it, looks maxing. All of these activities are referred to as looks maxing. penis stretching. Sometimes they talk about jelqing, facial implants, mewing, which is a particular type of exercises to try and improve the jawline, etc. Facial implants. So there's you know, there's the ones, I guess, who still believe it's worth trying. And then you have the black-pilled incels who have effectively given up. And you see in those spaces a real sense of despair, a real sense of self-pity, a real sense of self-loathing, and a deep sense of fatalism. So there's common references to suicide, to depression, and you know, when I look at, and I haven't now spent a huge amount of time looking at these communities for a few months because I've been engaged on other projects, but when I look at a lot of the black-pilled discourse, it seems to me that there isn't a huge amount of anger there. I mean, sometimes, of course, there is, but more often than not, there's a sense of despair, a really deep sense of self-loathing. But going back to that point where, you know, there are different levels, I guess, of extreme engagement. I think what you have in a lot of these communities are kind of architects or politically strategic actors who know what they're doing and are kind of mobilizing a lot of that self-loathing. And you know, that self-loathing can be collectively mobilized and turned outwards. Directed outwards, and that's, I guess, when you get manifestations of violence or attacks, different forms of attacks on women, be they verbal or, you know, there's also much more kind of creative, for want of a better word, kind of attacks like doxing or, you know, photoshopping women into pornography, hacking their websites. There can be hashtag, you know, very well organized hashtag campaigns against women, etc. And in the most extreme manifestations, then of course, mass shootings or mass killings of one form or another. So I think there's a level of, you know, strategic political mobilization of this self-loathing going on. I think at the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of young men who become involved or sucked into these groups because they're experiencing kind of social alienation. They feel that they're not, you know, socially adapted. They find social situations difficult. You do actually see a lot of them identifying as neuroatypical, not to make obviously any links between autism or neurodivergent people and these groups, or anti-feminism or misogyny at all. But I do think that it does seem that certain vulnerable young men are very easily kind of pulled into this space. They spend a lot of time on a computer. They're already kind of engaging in a lot of these spaces. They feel very, I suppose they have very low self-esteem in terms of their physique, and it's very easy for all of this, you know, despair to be channeled into anti-feminist or misogynistic anger, particularly when there's a lack of kind of social context going on. So you hear this from some ex-incels who talk about, you know, what they think was going on, and a lot of them will talk about, well, you know, when I was growing up, I was exposed to so many movies where you have these kind of hyper-masculine, hyper-muscular men. You have, you know, hypersexualized women. You know, there's a kind of an overload of that kind of imagery going on, and nothing, no kind of reality maybe to compare it to. And they say that they spend way too much time playing video games and engaging with this kind of unrealistic imagery, gender imagery in popular culture, and not enough time socializing, not enough time kind of learning how to develop psychosexually, and to go through, I suppose, all of the normal processes that we go through in terms of desire, rejection, and building resilience towards those processes, both male and female. They are led to believe in a kind of narrative, that women are greedy, self-serving, sexually greedy, always looking for only alpha males, etc., and that it's only men like them who suffer, rejection and humiliation. I guess in the absence of real life experiences, it's easy then to internalize a lot of this logic.
Right. And when we hear you explain all that, there seem to be loads and loads of very specific terms, like words, really some kind of terminology that is very specific to this, right? So you talk about the red pill, the black pill, the alpha males, the incels, you talk about maxing or something like that. So it really seems that there's a very specific language that is kind of maybe participates to the construction of this community, right? A specific way of speaking. And you've written, I think this is one of the main themes of your research on these communities, right? This kind of linguistic component, that kind of lingo, which seems to be very specific. What is this about? All these specific terms, do they play a role in a certain culture or community building, or is there some kind of symbolic aspect in this?
I think the key role is in kind of identity formation. Again, it goes back to this idea of us and them and the cult. And a lot of this language is extremely obscure and unintelligible to people who don't spend a lot of time online. And so that performs that function. I mean, their memes are the same. So the memes, perform that function of boundary work of creating in-groups and out-groups. And as soon as they become intelligible to people, they kind of move on to make them less intelligible. So there is that key function, I think, of very obscure language, and even very obscure use of certain symbols, etc. That are related to kind of coding or to kind of geek aspects of kind of a geekier kind of culture. All those things, I think, are very much about boundary policing and creating a sense of an in-group, of a community, and a certain identity, definitely, to keep others out, to keep normies and Stacys and Chads out and not able to understand what they're talking about. And a lot of the time you do get that sense that there is a kind of that circle jerk phenomenon, that members of these communities are less concerned in some ways with communicating their ideas to the outside world. They're much more concerned, I think, with impressing each other, seeking validation and reward from one another. And so you get this kind of what they call karma whoring, where recirculating and amplifying certain ideas or words or phrases or memes or whatever is kind of rewarded in a perpetual cycle. But it's very much about what's going on within the group more than any kind of outward political communication, I think, a lot of the time. If you compare that to kind of mainstream language within a still a patriarchal society, very often that's a much more subtle, the function of language is much more subtle. We see the way in which the language of liberal feminism has been kind of folded into a neoliberal capitalist society. So it's operating at a much more subtle, much more low level, I guess. But one of the things that I was really concerned with, because, you know, researching the manosphere, you're coming across so many obscure terms, and the deeper kind of you go into certain 4chan spaces, the more obscure the language gets. So I started looking at Urban Dictionary to understand or to find definitions, get a sense of what was going on with a lot of these words.
Right.
And then what I noticed was that so much of Urban Dictionary's definitions, so many of the definitions were sympathetic to this community.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so that's what kind of brought me into, and also to alt-right concepts and terminology as well. And that's what kind of brought me into doing a more systematic analysis of Urban Dictionary. So despite the fact that there's a lot of, I guess, very strict boundary policing, and there's a very obscure language, Urban Dictionary still functions as a way of mainstreaming a lot of this language and making it accessible to a wider audience, I think.
Right. So that kind of very specific language, which is very misogynistic, is actually being spread a little bit outside the boundaries. That's what you're saying. And so it kind of, it's harmful outside of the group even. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we do, you know, we've seen this on a much larger kind of political scale with the election of Trump, the way in which, you know, certain racist, homophobic and misogynistic language has become more acceptable. And there was a huge increase on the internet in the sheer quantity of misogynistic language, you know, since 2016, for example. So we're seeing that phenomenon much more broadly. But these this quite specific terminology of MRAs, of the manosphere, is certainly becoming more prolific through, I think, predominantly through Urban Dictionary, because it's such a hugely influential space, because so many young people engage with it. I'm sure there's, you know, YouTube is probably another space where we're seeing this kind of algorithmic radicalization, but that works in a slightly different way, in that it's pulling the mainstream into more extreme spaces.
Right.
Whereas I think Urban Dictionary is serving to make the more extreme spaces intelligible and to more mainstream audiences. Yeah.
Right. And so as I said in the very beginning, you've recently edited a book at Palgrave with your colleague Eugenia Siapera called "The Gender Hate Online: Understanding the New Anti-Feminism." Is that a book that kind of brings together a series of contributions that try to understand this whole composite movement? Could you briefly tell us what you think are the main highlights of the book, or the main sort of findings that emerged as the book was being built?
Sure. Well, I suppose the key logic for the book was trying to theorize, to go a little deeper with the why question. And because these phenomena are relatively new, and because it's very hard to keep up with them, they're ever changing, it's very dynamic, and there's lots of different platforms all the time. So you have the kind of the speed of technological development, and then the dynamism of these groups. And also, you know, these events like around Gamergate, or since Gamergate, which kind of changed the whole playing field, if you like. It's very hard, I think, for a limited number of researchers working in this area to kind of keep on top of what's going on. So a lot of the work necessarily has to be quite descriptive. It's just kind of grabbing hold of it and trying to document it, trying to capture it, and trying to make sense of it. And then kind of move on to the next thing, and the next thing, the next thing. And so we were kind of concerned, I suppose. It's not by no means a critique of the work that's being done, because it's absolutely vital to document and explain these phenomena. But we wanted to kind of, I suppose, every time you go to a conference and you present on on the manosphere or the incel phenomenon, a lot of people are quite horrified, or they're quite shocked by the level of misogyny And that's always a difficult thing to, to decide, to what extent you expose people, and how much or how extreme, or what level of extreme content you're willing to expose people to, or it's right to expose people to. And yet, there's a necessity to demonstrate not just the quantity, but the nature of this misogyny in order to understand it. And so people are usually pretty taken aback, that, very often, who aren't working in this area, very shocked. And the question people keep asking, the question journalists have been asking for years at this stage is, well, where does it come from? Why? It's frightening to think that this misogyny runs so deep. Has it kind of emerged out of nowhere? Has it always been there, but we never saw it? Has the internet just revealed it to us? Did men always want to decapitate us and rape us, but we just never realized, kind of thing? And so that's the question that people always want to know. And so that's the question we really wanted to address. There was other things we wanted to do as well. We wanted to move beyond just kind of Western, white Western perspective. We wanted to look at, what was going on in other parts of the world as well. And we also wanted to consider intersectional perspectives, to look at the way in which this misogyny intersects with racism in particular. So, those were the kind of greater aims, if you like, of the book. But first and foremost, both myself and Eugenia wanted to try and drill down into deeper understandings of how and why did this come about. So Eugenia took a very long historical Marxist analysis, which is brilliant, brilliant piece of work, in which she uses the work of Silvia Federici and the witch hunts of the Middle Ages to explain how at times where there's a kind of a shift or transition in the socio-economic order of things, that misogyny tends to become most extreme. And in order to kind of keep women in their place and to ensure the necessary relations that secure patriarchy, there need to be these very spectacular demonstrations of misogyny in order to kind of scare women. And that, that was the function of the witch hunts in the Middle Ages. And she argues that now, as we transition into a kind of new economic order, which is techno-capitalism, once again, there's a kind of an upheaval. So the more kind of traditional relations of employment, but also of kind of domestic relations, everything is once again an upheaval, and this to some extent explains why there has been such an upsurge in really violent, extreme misogyny again. So she puts it in this really brilliant historical context, which is, look, as long as there's capitalism, there's going to be patriarchy. As long as there's patriarchy, there's going to be misogyny. So, that's her kind of meta-analysis. My analysis is more of a kind of a look at what are the kind of conditions that enabled this to happen in the kind of gender, in the more recent gender political space. And so I think to a large extent the role that post-feminism has played has been overlooked. And so I argue that the almost 20 years of the dominance of post-feminism in our culture, before we had kind of new waves of digital feminism emerge, there was a space or a time period, a kind of a vacuum almost, where a lot of ideas that are very sympathetic to Manosphere thinking were already fomenting. And it was a very, I suppose it was a very gender politically unstable period of time, because words like patriarchy, misogyny, etc. all disappeared. Nobody used those words for at least 15 years. All of the rhetoric shifted, as Diane Negra and Yvonne Tasker have argued, from the realm of the political to the realm of the cultural, from the realm of the collective to the realm of the individual. And you had, all of the kind of tenets of second wave feminism turned on their head. So consumerism, individualism, all of these things became empowering. Female violence became empowering. Sexual self-objectification became empowering. Consumerism became empowering. All of the things that second wave feminism had fought against became turned on their heads. And also there was this shift toward genetic determinist thinking about gender, which was very compatible with a kind of post-feminist cultural logic, as well as the kind of a war of the sexes rhetoric, which was supposed to be, funny and ironic. But we saw this really quite extreme repolarization of gender in those years. So I think all of these things, and that's what my chapter tries to do, is try and document how all of these things were really kind of paving the way for the more extreme ideologies that then set in. With the Manosphere, it was much easier for men's rights activists to argue for evolutionary psychology, because we'd had 15 years of this kind of biodeterminist stuff being peddled at us in a more kind of innocuous way. And also the very kind of heteronormative war of the sexes stuff. All of this, I think, really set the culture up for for what was to come next, and really kind of weakened feminist defenses in many ways. But then, thankfully, we've seen a really brilliant kind of revival of much more radical feminism in the digital space as well, and a lot of response and reaction to this. So the book also documents that. The third part of the book looks at feminist responses online, digital feminist responses to online anti-feminism. So we're trying to do all of those things, I guess. That was the rationale for it.
Excellent. I think it's time to wrap up, but I will ask the same two questions that to finish with that I ask everyone. Just in one or two sentences, two questions, right? One on your future research. What are you studying now? Is it still this kind of online ecosystem, or are you moving towards something new? So just very briefly. And also for our audience, what would be the one book, and it cannot be the book that you just mentioned, your book, but what would be the one book that you would advise our listeners to go and read, a book on extremism?
Okay, so the first question, my research at the moment, I'm looking deeper into the incel community and into this idea of algorithmic radicalization and the way in which, say, YouTube in particular works to pull people deeper and deeper into more extremist content. But what I keep coming back to, and what I want to do, so I'm on sabbatical next year, and I want to really get into this, is to look, and this is very difficult research, is to start looking at the young men themselves, and to try and figure out, I suppose, a kind of it's not about doing kind of individual psychology, because my approach is always sociological, but it's trying to take in, to some extent, what's going on with these guys in terms of their lives, their perspectives, and how they actually get pulled into this way of thinking, and how they manage to kind of shut down the contradictions between this way of thinking and then things that are happening around them. So yeah, I want to do more research with people themselves, more kind of ethnographic research. And then in terms of a book that I would recommend, I think probably one of the most useful books is Michael Kimmel's Healing from Hate, in terms of extremist communication. Again, this is very much in that space, is trying to understand why and how people become radicalized into more extreme manifestations of the ideas that they became exposed to. You know, much more kind of mainstream cultural ideas can very quickly become quite extreme. And I think Michael Kimmel's book is really brilliant at doing that, Healing from Hate, how young men get into and out of violent extremism, because he also looks at how they exit those movements or those groups or those communities, and what they have to say retrospectively. And I think there's a lot of important information in listening to those accounts of ex-incels and their own understanding of how they got in and how they got out. If we really want to understand this, I don't think we're going to get anywhere if we just keep kind of getting angry and horrified. We have to understand, you know, how this happens and why this happens in order to make any kind of successful intervention, I guess.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the same for pretty much every single topic that we discuss here, be it the incel or, you know, the sort of Salafi jihadi communities or the far right communities. So really the need to understand, you know, the trajectories and the stuff offline, online also interactions is I think crucial. We have to wrap up and we have to finish here to stick with our sort of time constraints. I would just like to say thank you once again for joining me here on a call, and yeah, thanks a lot for all these very good insights into the Manosphere and the Incel community.
Thank you, Stefan.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. See you. Bye-bye.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language and cite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet,
to ensure that such events never occur again. Preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility